At 2 o'clock in the morning, who would you find out here?
So you'd find people hanging out, kids. You'd have gang members who would be here.
Terrifying moments as a person in a red hoodie opens fire at a group of people on a busy street in Roxbury.
Drug dealers who would be here.
Boston police are investigating a shooting tonight in Roxbury.
Prostitutes who, hanging out. Whoever would want to hang out in the streets. You'd have folks who were users, who were out here. But they're all members of the community.
And then these holy men want to walk the street. Maybe they thought you wanted to score some drugs.
Right.
All of our spirits, transform our hearts. Forgive us, Lord, of our many sins. In the name of Jesus. Lord, we pray, God, that even now, as we look out on the world,
So this is not wealthy,
Yeah.
but it's peaceful. It's a
Yeah.
lovely community.
Yeah.
Not too long ago, this was, sketchy, dicey,
Yes.
violent?
Yes.
Tell me a bit about it. Tell me what it was like.
Yeah. So, communities like this community, the housing stock was poor. It was not kept up well at all. There was a dearth of services for families and communities. You had lots of young people, lots of kids, in the community, with a lot of housing developments and housing projects. A lot of times they're full of people that the larger society would like to forget about. And so because of poverty, because of disadvantage. And so this is one of those communities that we would walk in because, it was critically important for us to be able, to find peace, but in a way that engages the community. About young people that I had before I engaged in the work was quickly dispelled once I got involved. For example, you would think that all these kids are concerned about is the violence and the money and the drugs and what it could bring for them. But when you actually have real conversations with young people who are involved in the streets, you find out that they are just like you, that, they've got dreams, they've got hopes. They are very limited in the options that they have to get through the system that has been created around them. And so with those limited options, they make do with what they can. And so, rather than thinking diabolically about these young people, you need to be more expansive and embrace the humanity that is before them and let them embrace your humanity.
Limited options, products of the system within which they grew up. Politicians don't, some politicians are willing to address the root causes, but there are others who want to go in and RoboCop the hell out of the thing, right?
Yeah, pretty much so.
Get rid of the drugs, the guns, iron fist, that'll clean up the streets. Tell me how much harder it is to go under the hood or under the surface and really try and reform a society? And what are the limitations given that the system is still the system? People are still growing up in a poorer neighborhood. Talk to me a bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, I always talk about it in a cultural and structural way, right? I mean, you have, the culture of violence that people will always talk about. And you'll have law enforcement and its various manifestations say that the way to do this is through the enforcement of the laws and getting the guns off the streets and lock them up and all of that. And even though they do a lot of that, it doesn't clean up the violence at all. And part of the reason is that once you do all of that, the system still remains. You still have the chronic underemployment as well as unemployment. You still have school systems that are public school systems that are poor. You still have, poor health care. You still have the disadvantages around housing and lack of housing.
And just to be clear about it, systemically racist, would you say that? Yeah.
Systemically
racist against the African American community here.
In my community in Boston, we find ourselves, limited in terms of homes that we own or being subject to the high cost of rent. That was as a result of the traditional redlining and the programs that came up in this city that limited where Black people could live and limited the way, the ways in which they weren't able to get loans for homes, and all that kind of stuff. All of that stuff accumulates. And so, once you bring all of that in, you add in poor health care, you see this violence start to erupt, and you think, we just deal with this cultural manifestation and that's it. But the system still remains.
You could be talking about the Middle East right now.
I know it, but I mean, it's very clear that once you keep the system as it is, you will always have the potential for things to explode once again. This world has always been about, the haves and the have-nots, right? And but it's not about, giving handouts to those who don't have. It's about power. It's about the people who define what it means to have and to have not, and to determine, who fits within those parameters. And as long as we have that as the overarching system, we'll continue to have these problems throughout our world.
And you've done amazing work in reducing violence here, in cleaning up the streets in the neighborhoods that you have an influence over, working with all these multiple stakeholders.
If you talk to the, to the stakeholders, they'll tell you, I was the police department, it was probation, it was the coordination.
Let them all take the credit.
Yeah, right. But, the reality is the community started to rise up. You had people like myself and folks like Tina Cherry and other, people who've had families who've been affected by violence and deciding to do something about it, sort of coming together in their own places and saying, we don't have to figure out how to cope with this. We can figure out how to overcome it. And so, so it wasn't just me, but people need to understand it really is about community empowerment. If you really want to reduce violence, within that, you have to find out how the community can be empowered to realize that that they can get through this, that their resiliency can be effective with the partnerships that are able to be engaged with the city. But with that, you also need to understand that these problems that we see, like violence, are systemic problems. They have systemic roots.
But how do you handle anger and rage when you do the good work, but you know that there's an elephant in the room, that there's a Goliath that still needs to be overcome?
Yeah.
Don't you feel helpless sometimes? Don't you feel immensely angry?
I have felt angry over the years because, well, we've had times in our city, for example, where we've had tremendous reduction in violence, only a few years afterwards seeing the violence rise again. So the frustration that comes with that, being able to, talk to individuals and see improvement in their lives, and then maybe years later seeing their children or their grandchildren involved in the same thing, it is frustrating. But what is also hopeful is that the more people get engaged, the more they see that what's happening around here is not just individuals or families or family systems, but there is a larger system afoot. And that in order for us to engage that, we need the courage, we need the temerity to be able to stand firm and say, we want to see a complete change, and not just a change, for the majority. We need change for everybody, which is the reason why I think the faith factor is so important. Because within faith, you talk about the least of these. Jesus talked about the least of these. And he was saying, if we're going to be able to have the society we desire, we have to pay attention and join with the least of these.
As you know, I'm from South Africa. I found that something that was an important glue in the anti-apartheid struggle was when you had someone like Archbishop Desmond Tutu appealing to the sort of liberation aspect of black people using scripture, but also the conscience of white people who were his co-religionists. They couldn't turn a blind eye to it. They couldn't look away. It hit them somewhere deep, deep in the feels, deep in the heart. Tell me about how important it is to use that sort of, that centralizing factor, that it's majority Christian here, to use faith to talk to everybody.
Yeah, I think for me, it's about a faith that comes from below, right? So we're not saying that faith is a quality of those of the enlightened and those who are the privileged, but faith is that grittiness that comes from below that gives people courage and resiliency in the midst of whatever's horrible is happening in the world. And to be able to get other people to see that really the very roots of a person's religious quest is really about getting to the heart of whatever matter that's happening in community and finding ways to heal that. That's the only way to move forward. Now, when we would talk to folks about this work, I would get much more resonation about the work that I was doing from the people who had members who were involved in the community, or who had relatives who were involved in the community. They could relate to that. Some of the shall I say, larger church pastors or churches that, had people commuting in to worship and then commuting out into the suburban, parts of the state, they were less inclined to listen to what I had to say. But there was always something compelling about what I was saying, And all I'm saying is that if you really look at this Christian faith, it really centralizes around not just, the words of Jesus, but the actions of Jesus. And and there are folks who will, call themselves red letter Christians, for example, because they look at the words of Jesus. And if you concentrate on that, then, you see that our mandate is not for us to just live a good life and make sure you don't hurt anybody, but we have neighbors, we have folks who are suffering, and you can't be well if they are not well. And so it's our mandate to do all that we can to provide the opportunity for everyone to be well, in their lives. And if we have to do it for the rest of our lives, then so be it.
Is there a difference between listening to the victim of the criminal and the criminal?
Not in my world, because, for me, oftentimes they're interchangeable. You have the victim who was the perpetrator, earlier on. But what you listen to is the mutual suffering, because when you're talking about working with gangs, when you're talking about working with those who are a part of the drug trade, you're still talking about a community that is hurting and that is suffering. And that although you may feel like you have a little power because you have a gun, you really don't have the power, because the forces that we are contending with are much larger than what you would have in your hand. And so for me, it's important to listen to all of it and to be able to embrace all of it, and then help folks to move to another place in their lives. I would always tell young people, I'm not trying to change who you are. I'm trying to change your direction in life, because who you are is important to me. And your direction is where you're going to become a better person. And so for me, it's about the direction, right? For folks who are a part of the system, it's like there's something wrong with that person. No, there's something wrong with the system, and the people are struggling within it. And they're not looking for a placation that would sort of continue the lives the way it is. They're looking for transformation, not just of themselves, but of the system as well.
And how do you respond to your flock when they tell you, we look at the news and we hear the names, Trayvon Martin,
Yep.
George Floyd,
Yep.
Michael Brown,
Yep.
day after day, week after week, month after month, African Americans being killed by cops around the country. How do you deal with their desperation or helplessness or anger as their leader?
Absolutely. You enter into the spaces where the pain is, and you sit with them, you join with them, you shoulder it with them, and then you move them forward into a different place. I always say to my congregants, we serve a God that takes the impossible and brings it into the realm of possibility. And for us, it's really important to understand that even though we have setbacks in our lives, we have hope, because we have each other and we have a God that we serve that can pull us beyond our circumstances to where we need to be. But we do it together. So it's not me just preaching and then just sort of ignoring their lives for another week and then next Sunday coming back, but it's also engaging.
Have they tested you? I mean, when I would imagine someone would say something like, well, you still want to talk to the cops? You still want to engage with the cops when this whole thing is rigged against us?
Yeah. I always say to folks who say that to me, well, you shouldn't be talking to the cops. So I'm like, you have to talk to everybody. Just like you want the cops to talk to you or listen to you, you have to listen to everybody. And that's a difficult conversation, right? And not every cop is going to be responsive. Over the years, I always tell people that it was a certain group of cops that we worked with. It wasn't the entire police department. The entire police department was a mess of people who, just wanted to lock everybody up, that was the only way to do decent enforcement, in a community. But there were other cops who were like, okay, we see the complexity here. We understand the value of having a community leader or a faith leader, involved in all of this. And so we built trust with you so that together we can figure this out. And when you have those kind of police officers, then you have an opportunity to actually do something transformational in the community.
The right wing likes to highlight the African Americans who focus on personal responsibility and family. Thomas Sowell, Larry Elder, these types. What was that? The sheriff of Milwaukee as well.
Crazy guy.
Yeah. So I interviewed him once. He's about 6'3". He has his gun on him. I was afraid, honestly. But they like to say, no, it's not about the system. The system is not systemically racist. It's because there are lack of fathers in these households. It's personal responsibility. It's black on black violence. It's the communities themselves that need to reform themselves. It's not some white system on the outside that's oppressing you. Do you engage with that at all?
Not at all. And I don't engage in it.
Sheriff Clarke, that's his name.
Clarke.
He was a very scary guy.
Still is, I imagine, but as long as he stays away from me. When there are individuals who come to me and say, isn't this about the family? Isn't this about, the way someone was raised and all of that? I usually respond by saying, if you were raised in the circumstances that they were in, if your family, and a lot of these young people that I work with come from two-parent families because the family is ensconced, in this in this system. And when you have people who are in that with very limited resources, limited opportunities, and people who would just ignore them, first before helping them, you find people trying to figure out the best way they can to survive.
They're doing what they can in the circumstances that they find
They're
themselves
doing what they can in the circumstances that they find themselves in. And we fault them for, in some ways, being resilient, as a human being, But for those people who say it's not the system, it's this part of it, I see that argument as part of the larger sort of politicization of these circumstances that should not be about politics.
And the system might be the reason why you don't get to spend time with your dad and a white kid gets to spend more time with their dad, right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, it could still be the system behind that.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Right?
I remember a young woman that I had to work with on the street. She was involved with the probation department. Come to find out that she was one of 11 kids. Mom and dad both worked 2 jobs to keep everybody together, and she just happened to be one of the kids that fell through the cracks, So that family did not fit that neat box that Sheriff Clarke would build, in his argument. And many of the families that I work with don't fit in those boxes, It's a part of the uncomfortable truth about the system that we live in, that there is pressures to, have people rise at the expense of others. And for someone like myself, I've been involved, in the community too deeply to be tricked by, those kinds of arguments.
To be tricked.
I would look at Sheriff Clarke and I would say to him, you need to come and get in the community without your gun and without your badge, and we'll see, where you end up. If you truly want a community that is peaceful, you have to be a part of the solution for that.
The fact that you helped reduce the suffering of this community, your community, by so much, spanning more than an entire generation, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, you know, it's funny you say that, because, you know, as I operate, I'm not focused on looking back and seeing the progress and beaming with pride, or
That's why,
like
as
that.
outsiders, it's good that we come in.
Right. I mean, I'm still focused on the next part of this journey. Like the assignment is not completed. You know, the job is not done yet. And my focus now is on, within this peaceful community, connecting families to generational wealth building, so that this peace that we're experiencing will actually last.
And there can be prosperity on top of the
And there can be
peace.
prosperity along with the peace, because my community deserves it. Because the families that have endured this and have suffered through this and have worked to make it better, they deserve to enjoy the fruits of the peace that they produced.
So do you.
Yeah.
So do you.
Well, if they're happy, then I'm happy.
Beautiful. Let's get out of the cold. It's cold.